Hello, John.
Morning, Maren.
Morning, John. We've been sitting in an MA class for 2 years together, and I have watched the coming together of this book and this delightful book. So, what kind of beast are we launching here into this world? You've written you said before that your sisters have already written, your family story. There's been memoirs written. So this is not a struggle book. This is something else. It's not a clear memoir. It is something much more complex and poetic than just a memoir or a piece of non-fiction. And I wanted to ask you about a little bit to read to us about the shifting focus of how this book came into being. If you'd like to read to us about how this happened. And it has a lot to do with your wife Ntombi.
Absolutely. I think the whole book was negotiated, and the negotiations with Ntombi and to an extent her mother were critical in powering the book. It was through negotiations you consider ethical issues, literary issues, who's really in charge here. Of course, Ntombi always is. And that partnership in life is what drives me, and hence I wanted to be a book about our partnership, our relationship. I had a very big motivation which got lost a bit in the shifting, is to show off Ntombi to the world. Here's this absolutely remarkable woman, and I'm proud of her, and I want to share her with the world. But it became something a bit deeper than that. After retiring as a senior government official in 2018, I decided to write a memoir. I began with the first chapter, which is about accessing memories that in my case are normally obscured by stress. But where to go from there? I did not want to write a book about my achievements or my participation in the struggle. My wife suggested I write a book about Gogo. Ntombi, a retired lieutenant colonel, is persuasive, and I thought it a good idea to tell the story of Gogo's life. It demands to be told, and Ntombi promised to assist as I hardly speak any isiZulu. Ntombi avoided my attempts to conduct formal research and began to tell anecdotes about her and her mother's shared history at dinner. I vaguely wondered why she had begun insisting we have dinner together, which did not happen often after our children left home. I made sure there was a notebook and pen next to my plate when I set the table, and she insisted that I should sit next to her. Being half deaf, I made no objections. When we finished eating, Ntombi would begin telling stories. Most often they were about her impoverished childhood, which she spent with Gogo until she was 12 years old. Ntombi is wide and has pinned-together spine and 2 artificial knees. She occupies a solid wooden armchair at the head of the table, where she can sit down and leave easily, and from where she can be queen, chairperson, and operations manager. It also allowed her to tell the stories dramatically. The upper part of her body is strong, and she talked as much with her hands as her mouth. Warnings were given if I interrupted or contradicted her, with occasional physical and verbal threats when I became too irritating. I realized that Ntombi had meant all along that I should write a book about her and include Gogo and me. Her tactic was to employ a form of respectful isiZulu speech called hlonipha. Alternatively, she was being devious or both. I was never sure, which is probably the point of hlonipha.
Great, thank you very much. So, and then I think a few paragraphs later, the real depth that you speak of the story comes out. And I think this is what drives the story, is the absolute, there's an emotional drive and a lyrical underlying thing driven by a deep feeling. And if you'd let me read that. It gradually dawned on me that the book would be about a struggle after all. The never-ending struggle between me and Ntombi. and it must be about love. Our stormy relationship revolves around our unbounded love for each other. Early on in the writing process, after we had a violent argument, I asked Ntombi what would happen to the work if we parted for some reason. My words made her face twist up in a way that shocked me. "That will never happen," she replied. "You irritate me a lot, but you are now part of me." I silently vowed that only death would part us, and perhaps not even then. And I think this is sort of love, the deep love that you've sort of set up right in the preface, is what carries this whole story through and forward. It's what holds it together in many ways. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful. And how did you land up with this really a piece that has a deep internal integrity, which is all that one can hope for, like a poem?
Yes, and I was striving for authenticity of feeling, of even facts as I remember it, because a memoir is facts through many filters. So it would not be authentic if it became a bit of historiography. But what I needed was a couple of external people to kind of knock some sense into me. Because it became more and more crammed with anecdotes from my memory that kept floating up, and I thought how witty, how wise, and I shoved the anecdote in. And my supervisor on the course sort of came with a way of stopping me with this frenzy of anecdotes and said, "Why don't you write it as a series of essays?" And she just wanted me to do that, I think, as a temporary thing and get the course over with. And that's what happened. I wrote it as a series of essays, each one with its own mood and context. And then both the examiners who looked at this thing said, "But it should be one book." And I agreed with them. And then I needed someone outside the process to do a structural edit. And I got a journalist who has not got a literary background, is a fine writer, but she did a sensible showing these chapters could fit with those, and this is just repetition, get rid of it. So that structural edit took her full time, sitting in Australia, and that got me started. But then I had to do a solid year of 6 hours a day, working away at the weaving, but keeping the integrity of the essays. And I could not have done it without constant going back and forth to Ntombi. Is this really what happened in your childhood? And that depth of understanding of her life and myself is only just starting. But this book will have to stay where it is as a frozen slice of that process. But every day I learn more about her. And as I said, that's probably normal. A couple don't really know each other till they retire, and then they need to do something.
In a big piece like that, to keep that thread and that kind of narrative as opposed to story going, to keep that light sort of focused, it's quite interesting that you used Ntombi to keep you anchored in the story. But somewhere inside you, a writerly intuition must have continued to guide you from one place to the other. What kept you on the path as a writer, as your own intuition?
I think you've got to find the core. Once I realized it's about our love and explaining how our love survived, then I could balance it and find a balance between the detail and the selection of the detail. So I gave up a whole lot of detail. And Ntombi nearly died during COVID. I saved her life by going out and finding the last oxygen concentrator on the market. All of that's out. So I got rid of a whole lot of very juicy things, and that's my supervisor's still small voice, that if I don't do that, the reader will get lost in the woods and will never forgive me. So it's those still small voices and sticking to what was important to Ntombi as well as me. the moving of houses. I never realized how they devastated her. Each time she lovingly developed a house, then 3 years later I switched jobs, sold it. I had no idea of my children suffering at school, losing their friends every time. So the emotional shock of discovering the damage I did to my family. People think I exaggerated. I don't think I did. She kept bringing me back to that and telling me I was very serious what I did to her.
So this is an extremely honest and sometimes painfully honest book, John. How has it been to write? How do you feel now, and how do you and Ntombi feel now? It feels almost like it was cathartic, and a lot of writers write this kind of book as a kind of cathartic experience. How do you feel? Do you feel you've put something down? What does Ntombi feel about you having written this now?
Well, we both set limits, and it was particularly fascinating to explore, because she still has a relationship with her family. I have a relationship with my family, and we have a relationship with comrades and colleagues that we were with abroad and so on. We still see them. So it's feeling your way through those ethical and personal choices that shape all memoirs, indeed ethnography and many parts of social science. You use that as a thermometer to guide you to a version of the truth that you can stick to.
So, okay, the book is divided, you say, the 20 chapters are in 3 parts. There's the before Ntombi and you met, there's your life in exile, and then there's the domestic life that you are sharing with us. And I think for me, part 1 is the most poetic and literary, because later it's sort of almost more, you relate events as they happen. And I think in part 1 sort of opens up the reader before, the way to read part 2 and part 3. It sort of opens up an internal world, and sometimes quite a feral and wild open world. And I think to me that got quite delighted by that. And I wanted you to read page 6 and 7 about where you use other literary devices.
But I do interlace fiction, non-fiction in this passage. So
Okay.
I could see somebody moving. It's me sitting looking across the swimming pool at our bedroom. I could see somebody moving behind the lace curtains of our children's rooms. First, the face appeared in Bussi's room, then in Sipo's, which was next to our bedroom. It was Nomvula Mbele, the mother of Ntombi, known as Gogo, who joined us when we returned from exile in 1993. The children have left home, but wherever they are, they will always be close to their Gogo and protective of her. The pain in my hands distracted me, so I wrote a complaining poem in the manner of a fictional bear who composed little complaining songs. I used to sing them to Bussi. For instance, in Painful Pursuit of Honey, the bear sang how nice it would be to be a bee. To distract myself further, I imagined I was a cranky old poet, plagued by imagined ex-wives, each one gaunter and more vengeful than her predecessor. I scribbled a poem on a paper napkin and then typed it. Dearest dears, the arthritic poet said, I grind my bones to make your bread. I could not be referring to Ntombi. She is my one and only wife and is not at all gaunt. She is the maker of bread, although badly afflicted by degeneration of the joints, and her bones grind together worse than mine. Another couplet popped into my mind. She's a mover, a shaker, a planter, and a baker.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I wanted to know, so you were talking about A.A. Milne and Winnie the Pooh. So this is quite unconventional to throw like bits of silly poems in there. I wanted to know your literary influences. What are the strong literary influences that you think might have come through? You might not know it exactly, but who do you read with great
Well, who did
passion?
I read in order to write this memoir? Was part of the course was to read a lot of books
Yeah.
with the aim of giving one impetus. So it was something we both had to do as students. And I deliberately went for an unusual one, the hard novels, the romance dur of Simenon. Not his Inspector Maigret stories, but his very hard psychological novels, where he limited his vocabulary to 5,000 words and famously used to come out of his study holding a book by the spine and shaking it to get the last adverb or adjective out that may have hidden in there somewhere. And so I read him before when I was writing official reports for the government, because he's very rigorous in how he does sparse and effective writing. So that was to get me non-poetic but very economical. And then for the poetic thing, I went back to books I remember as being very lyrical, and the Bridge of St. Louis Ray by Thornton Wilder is a sustained piece of poetry. And the other reason was that I'll be working with Zulu quite a lot, trying to explain about Zulu, the Zulu's culture and so on. And he was mainly a French expert in French literature, but he knew enough Spanish to get into Spanish literature. And he uses Spanglified English in order to make poetry. And the second writer who does that superbly is the person who wrote the 1001 Nights. Just remind me of the name.
I don't know who
Sir
wrote
Richard
it.
Francis Burton. He wrote
transcribed.
the most wonderful prose based on his knowledge of Arabic, Farsi, and he uses ancient English forms. Like instead of pity, he uses the word ruth. So he uses hundreds of old English forms, but in order to convey the flavor of the Arabic. So those were the two very lyrical works and other works of Sir Francis Burton. And this Bridge of St. Louis Ray, which interweaves 5 tales of people who fell to their deaths, and this mad priest wants to know why has God made a mistake here. So those are the kind of preparations I did.
I'm going to read a piece where I find the wonderful mix of the poetic, and then that is completely pulled into the groundedness of Ntombi. I think this is a really beautiful piece of writing that opens us up into a surreal world and then gets grounded particularly strongly by Ntombi and by the storytelling. Our house is somewhere near the center of South Africa. At the bottom of the pool, there's a plastic image of a compass with the 4 cardinal points correctly aligned. Swimming through the stratosphere in directions suggested by the compass, I tried to catch glimpses of my past, which was covered by clouds of stress. I always suspected that this was the result of my existence irritating the universe and Ntombi. I swam to 5 places in Africa that I would reach if I traveled north, south, east, and west. They were all places that surfaced as I flew through my memories, stirring up the sediments. The first place was Tanzania, which I would reach if I flew northeast, using the updrafts as I approached the tropics. I fell from the sky into a seat in a bus on its way to a game park, 40 kilometers from our home in Morogoro. The ANC had established an education complex outside the town, the Solomon Mahlangu Freedom College, SOMAFCO. Ntombi was seated next to me, surrounded by students, some of whom were from my history and English classes. We had fallen in love shortly after she arrived in Mazimbu to set up modern kitchens at the school. We were going on one of our rare outings. Ntombi had never been to a game reserve before. Under apartheid, such facilities were reserved for whites only. Her first remark after we entered the gate was, "The management is useless. Look how dirty those elephants are." I did not attempt to explain why they were so muddy. After lunch at the lodge, we walked back to the bus with the students. I asked her about a strange sound that kept repeating. "Is that a bird call or an insect?" Ntombi was surprised at my ignorance. "That is the knives and spoons some students have hidden in their socks," she explained. I think it's such a lovely piece of storytelling. And it starts off in the surreal, very literary way, and then gets pulled into a perfect kind of groundedness. So
I attempted that deliberately, but mostly, as you know yourself, it's highly inorganic, and it took a full year to achieve those kind of flights of fancy and the groundedness, and it emerged. And then in the editing, I edited it more than 40 times, and I had a couple of professional editors show me where something didn't work, and those are important. And I might not be able to pull it off again. This may be a once-off.
I suppose becoming a writer or emerging as a writer or pushing oneself as a writer is to develop those literary instincts.
I was explaining that there's the rootedness in domesticity and the location of domesticity in a world of climate change, of Trump, of nuclear war, and then things like the war in Ukraine are almost predicted by the way the realities are described. And in South Africa, as L.B. Sachs once said, is just the world written large or projected on a screen. So in the way our state works, colonialism has not even begun to be addressed, the greedy elites and so on. It's not new to South Africa, but it's come right into our domesticity and disrupts it. So that is the other achievement of the book, perhaps, is to balance the domestic with the outside happenings and keep it subdued so the politics doesn't interfere with the reader's understanding. And I've deliberately left out whole big political issues I'm not going to mention now, because they would take away from the inner dialogue and the relationship with Ntombi, and would turn the book into something else.
I suppose the whole book is a political endeavor and an intimate political, because it's an interracial marriage in South Africa, and it's about love, interracial love, which is a big act. It's a huge political act, if one wants to say that, or it's a act of defiance at some stage.
The interracial thing and so on expressed itself outside of the family. That's why one of the most moving things for me is remembering my child's first day at a primary school in South Africa, the one I attended as an all-white school, and yet she felt isolated there. The children, when I collected her, all the black and brown children were in the sandpit waiting for their parents. Not speaking to another, just pushed there by the racial currents running through that school. And Busi came to the car and said, "You're white, Mummy's black, and I'm colored." That just broke me. I couldn't reply to her. I was broken by that, because it's like a very poor child who never knew they were poor, suddenly being exposed to the poverty of their life. Exactly like that. I was exposed to the racial realities, because our family, we had got beyond that. But it's when we interacted with the external world in Sunderland and so forth. And I was always more terrified than Ntombi of assaults on the family and so forth. And so it's more the reaction of the world to us, not that we felt we were doing something particularly extraordinary.
Okay, the book then finally in part 3, it sort of settles into lockdown. It goes much further into domesticity, and in many ways, this book is about old age, and also about how one relates differently to history in old age and to politics in old age, where you have different perspectives. You're not the ones right at the beginning. I loved very much how, so everything is pared down, everything is becoming less. You are becoming more isolated, like less, you're not working anymore, you're becoming more focused on each other. And I wonder whether you could just read to us page 176 to 177, and then we'll be done.
Yeah. Okay, now I think you've caught it, so that the book mentions our childhood and births even, and then it ends with aging. So it's a bit of a cycle going on there. And then we every day discover that we comfort one another, our love grows bigger, and we solve political problems by extending our understanding of the world, or indeed one of us advancing more than the other and the other catching up. So I discovered preparations for the ceremony were already advanced. This is Ntombi's burying of her two siblings who died of poverty, basically, and hunger and violence directly attributable to apartheid. I discovered preparations for the ceremony were already advanced, and a company contracted to provide a tent, chairs, a portable toilet, and catering. She asked me to assist with ordering a tombstone and slab with a message she would compose. I phoned my former secretary, Adelaide, whose advice I still seek from time to time, and who comes from KwaZulu-Natal. The company she recommended provided excellent and affordable service. I took with us a sound system and battery to power it, plus a handheld camera to record the event and the amplified speeches. I booked the three of us into the Boere and Brit, a friendly guest house in Ladysmith. We drove down to complete preparations and to investigate what building a cottage near the grave would entail. Busi and Siba would join us the day before the unveiling, and I invited a young architect. He was a family friend and had sketched possible plans for a house. Ntombi contacted members of the scattered families and related clans, some of whom were willing and able to come. The film of the event is available on the grassedimage.com website, and it shows Ntombi at her most formidable, as well as the speeches of Abel, her great father, and two other relatives. There are subtitles in English. It gives a glimpse of the broad valley in which KwaMte is situated, and the hillside which Ntombi used to climb up from her homestead as a child, carrying food to secret ANC meetings held on top. In her speech, if you are attentive, you will hear Ntombi mention that while in exile, she dreamt she flew back to KwaMte, much as I imagine flying over Southern Africa in the first chapter of this book. Her dead siblings, Thembelihle and Sifiso, were holding her hands as they flew with her. I had never heard of this dream. Among many other things, she had kept the world of the spirit secret until she felt I was ready to hear about it. Our project to build a cottage and live among the community will unfold, and we will report our progress on the website using photos and text. Amongst other obstacles, the council had allowed contractors to quarry away a large slice of the hill exactly where Ntombi planned to build. It has damaged the look, feel, and ecology of the hill, and the council has probably broken national and local laws related to consultation and the environment. Attracting tourists to look around and have a cup of tea will be more difficult, among other development opportunities lost. They were not aware that dreams of building that house had kept Ntombi's hopes alive across decades of exile and the struggle to give birth to a new South Africa. Someone from another clan built a house on land adjacent to the quarry. At the KwaMte end of the valley, there is no formal administration of land tenure, and rights mainly rest on historical occupancy by clans and evidence such as graves. We had to initiate an ongoing legal process to establish who had the right to use the land. The COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine are escalating the cost of building material and the diesel we would need to travel between our two homes. There will be other wars, climate change, more jobs lost, starvation, and serious unrest, given our sick state and politics. We are rapidly aging with multiple aches and pains. But Ntombi is Ntombi, and my love for her is still growing. I think it's a good ending.
It's a beautiful ending.